Well, good afternoon. As I understand my role here, I'll be kicking off a tour of the world's nuclear horror spots with Iran. And instead of talking about the present, I'll be talking about the future. Actually, about a possible future. I want to make that clear from the outset, that I'll be describing sort of one reasonably plausible scenario that may not work out this way, but it's certainly a scenario that the Iranians are thinking about, and a scenario that a lot of people in the West who are negotiating with the Iranians are thinking about. I think the most charitable interpretation of Iranian actions, motivations, and behavior that we can afford in the West is that at the very least they are thinking very seriously about acquiring some version of a nuclear capability. We've had debates about whether an Iran with a fully operationalized nuclear capacity can be contained or not, but we haven't really discussed what does it look like for there to be a Middle East with an Iran sitting there that has a couple of steps away from a full nuclear arsenal. So I'd like to use my 15 minutes to start a conversation about this. And just to preview my conclusion, or maybe it's not a full conclusion, more a suspicion, is that this would actually be a pretty unstable outcome. And this is contrary to what I expected when I first started looking at this. But I think there'll be a pretty dangerous incentive structure in place if Iran is sort of near an operational nuclear capacity, because there'd be several factors pushing Iran sort of further on that spectrum of nuclear capacity. And here's sort of where the way stations that I'll be taking to reach that conclusion. And I think what is somewhat surprising is that the cause that an Iranian advanced nuclear capability would be so destabilizing is actually their unprecedented transparency. The Iranian nuclear program has grown up under IAEA supervision, and that has some non-obvious consequences. So let me just get moving here, but before I do, let me tell you about some of the assumptions that I have going into this, because I'm talking about a future that isn't certain, that I don't necessarily expect as inevitable, but sort of one that we should be talking about. And the first assumption here is that Iran currently is it doesn't have an evil master plan to immediately build as big a nuclear arsenal as it possibly can in the quickest way possible. There's sort of this view that the only thing that has kept their nuclear program relatively modest is sanctions, some of the sabotage that has been undertaken by anonymous governments, and the presence of IAEA inspectors. Reasonable people, of course, disagree on whether that is the case or not, but let's just set that point of view aside for the moment, and I will assume that the technical choices that Iran has made in its nuclear program reflects more sort of an uncertain strategy of trying to sort of advance a nuclear capability without a clear endpoint. And I think the main data point that I would suggest is important here is that instead of focusing on mass producing their first generation centrifuge, which would probably be the quickest way for it to amass a large amount of fissile material, Iran is continuing to develop next generations and doesn't really seem to be in too much of a rush to build up a very large HEU reservoir. Now, I also assume that none of the major actors that are involved in this nuclear drama will really change their behavior in the next, say, 10 years than they have in the previous 10 years. So this means on the Israeli side, of course, they will keep talking about bombing the Iranian facilities, but will not actually do so. The Iranians will sort of stick to roughly the same strategy of incrementally improving their nuclear capacity, and the United States will stick with our current dual-track strategy of coercing on the one side with military threats, with sabotage, and on the other hand, offering incentives and sort of the way out of the pressure that's being built up, sort of a release valve of diplomacy. And I think we should also assume that the IAEA will maintain some kind of a presence on the ground in Iran. Currently, you have on average, biweekly inspections at the known uranium enrichment facilities. So let's sort of assume that keeps going on. I think with these assumptions in place, we can still imagine Iran moving to a very advanced nuclear capacity, and something that you could call a virtual nuclear arsenal. What is a virtual nuclear arsenal? You hear this term used somewhat casually these days, but it used to be a center point of a pretty active debate, at least 2 points in our history. And there's 2 main ways of defining what a virtual nuclear arsenal looks like. The first one is to simply look at the stocks of fissile materials that are available to a state and sort of say, okay, well, they have enough HU, they have enough plutonium to, if they wanted to, turn these into a weapon. And the assumption is if they have the engineering wherewithal to produce the fissile material in the first place, it's probably not too much of a stretch for their engineers to put together a pretty simple warhead. The second definition doesn't really take that latter step quite as lightly and looks more at the knowledge base and the expertise of the people who are operating the program. And that sort of assumes that these people have done that kind of have built a nuclear arsenal in the past. So they have that, all those skills that we're worried about losing in the U.S. at the moment when the generation of nuclear weapons designers is retiring, and there's this idea that the new bomb designers haven't really had that hands-on experience. These 2 definitions come from 2 different historical periods. The first one that focuses purely on the materials is sort of a product of, it started in the 70s, and it's sort of something that we talk about as nuclear latency at this point. And you talk about Japan and other countries that have very advanced energy programs, and you sort of look at them and say, okay, well, how far are they away from actualizing that capacity into a nuclear capacity of a full arsenal? The focus on the knowledge comes from this disarmament wave in the starting in the early 90s, where there was an expectation that perhaps the nuclear powers would be drawing down their arsenals to something close to nuclear zero. And the virtual nuclear arsenal idea came about through the thought that, well, maybe you can't really talk about nuclear zero per se, but you have to measure degrees above or below zero, because this knowledge sort of is pervasive and exists. And the argument at the time was, would it be a stable outcome if the major powers reduced and had this recessed nuclear capacity? Would, in the event of a crisis, everyone immediately rush to full nuclearization or not? This debate was never quite settled, but it sort of faded away along with the idea that nuclear disarmament would be happening in the near or medium-term future. For our purposes here, I think we can safely combine these 2 definitions of a virtual nuclear arsenal into the measurement of how long does it take a state to go from its ostensibly civilian nuclear program to an operational nuclear capacity, and you sort of measure that in time increments. But the crucial point here is that there aren't any major points of uncertainty along the way, but that you have a pretty good idea of how quickly you can get there and how you would go about doing this. Now, my thought typically is that if a country is interested in breaking out in a nuclear way, they probably want more than one weapon. So let's just assume here that a virtual nuclear arsenal would sort of be a 1 + n number of warheads. And finally, if we're looking again at the timeline, to really be a true virtual nuclear arsenal, I think you should be looking at days and weeks that it takes to operationalize rather than months. So with Iran, I'll be applying this concept of the virtual nuclear arsenal and sort of see if it helps us understand what an advanced Iranian nuclear capacity would look like. Here's a little bit of information about the present and what it might look like in a couple of years. Depending on whose calculations you believe, Iran is at the moment about a year away from producing sufficient HEU for a single nuclear warhead. Over the next couple of years, that time will be reduced significantly, at least in half, especially if progress is steady with some of their newer generations of centrifuges. And this is something a little bit further down the line, but at some point they'll also have a plutonium option once Iraq is up and running. So this is the fissile material side of Iran. The question is, what would it take to turn that into an actual warhead? As we know from the IAEA reports, Iran has acquired a Chinese warhead design through the AQ-CON network, and has been undertaking some implosion type simulations and has been doing some research. But from some of the information I received from people who understand much more about this than I do, these aren't terribly advanced, although obviously still quite worrying. So Iran doesn't quite yet have a reliable and functioning warhead design, and before they have one, they might have to test a weapon, although maybe they wouldn't have to. So at the moment, you can't really describe Iran as having a virtual nuclear arsenal because you have these little spots of uncertainty. But I don't think that it's too far off. If Iran really tried, there aren't any major obstacles that would prevent them from getting there. Of course, they also need a delivery vehicle. If the warhead design is too big and unwieldy, maybe the best approach would be to place it on a boat, such as this one, and drive it into an enemy's harbor, or maybe drive it up to an American battle carrier group and try to detonate it there. But of course, Iran would mostly be thinking about using this kind of a nuclear capacity in the event of a crisis. And in that case, they'd probably have a blockade in place, and there'd probably be no port that they'd be interested in detonating a nuclear weapon in that would gain admission to an Iranian vessel. And it certainly wouldn't be let near an American carrier group. So another option might be a gravity bomb. Here they could use an old Iranian Air Force plane or maybe a civilian plane. But if you've just bet the house on developing a couple of precious warheads, you probably don't want to fly them off and leave them at the mercy of vastly superior air defenses. So missile delivery, of course, as usual, is the best option here, and there are good indications that Iran is working to improve its missile capacity and also to develop warhead designs that would be able to survive the forces that it would be subjected to in ballistic flight. Of course, one of the obstacles here in a crisis situation, if we're looking into the future, is the missile defense system, that the phased adaptive approach that the U.S. with its NATO allies is trying to put in place. Whether or not that would be 100% effective is not clear, but again, it's the same calculation that you'd have to make as an Iranian, which is, with a limited amount of warheads, do I really bet that the missile defense system wouldn't work, or would it? At the moment, the U.S. is very confident that it would be able to detect any moves towards weaponization, and I think they have good reason to be this confident about it, because as we can see from the sabotage that has happened and from the revelations of facilities that the Iranians really had intended on keeping secret, their program is deeply penetrated, and even if they try to clean up and try to identify where the leaks are coming from, they, given the history here, really don't know that there isn't someone on the inside that might be passing along information. Finally, of course, the IAEA is on the ground and is making inspections, and even if those are limited and they're not seeing everything, their very presence is also another risk. So I think if we're moving into this future scenario that I was outlining earlier, in which Iran had a very clear and short path to a weaponization of its nuclear program mapped out, it would be a fairly easy task for the U.S. to first detect it and then disable it, because the strike capacity is there. So in a strange sense, the nuclear option for the Iranians would sort of fall off the table as soon as they reached for it. This is a big slide that sort of, the main point that I'm trying to make here is that the Supreme Leader is in charge of these big kinds of nuclear decisions. And I think that if he decided that an advanced nuclear option were desirable and required, The military, or probably the Revolutionary Guard, would be put in charge of developing this kind of a pathway forward that they could call upon in the event of a crisis and make all the relevant preparations that would allow them to actualize from a virtual nuclear arsenal into an actual capability. But if the Iranian military or the Revolutionary Guard is the same as most militaries in the world, they will look at some of the variables that I've been describing, and they would probably conclude that they wouldn't really want to go to war with a virtual nuclear arsenal, and that kind of a weapon may be a touch too philosophical. So at this point, we can imagine that the military put in charge of planning for a breakout would argue that they need to shorten that timeline as much as they possibly can. And if the leader went along with that, I think you'd see a very quick escalation or progression from a virtual nuclear arsenal into an actual arsenal just for these bureaucratic political reasons. So in short, the crisis dynamics of an Iranian virtual nuclear arsenal would be very uncomfortable for the Iranians, and that's because of the program's penetration by Western and Israeli intelligence and the unprecedented transparency that has been involved with having your nuclear program grow up almost completely under IAEA supervision. So the problem is that Iran really has no survivability, at least no guaranteed survivability. And in the chain of events required to use, or at least to credibly threaten to use, its nuclear capacity, Iran would face significant uncertainty at nearly every step. So you have to add to this fact that Iran may need to test a warhead design that can be delivered by a missile. And in a crisis, a test might be a useful signal of resolve, but it will also use up a lot of HEU. And then, of course, the question is, what if the test fails? So finally, unless Iran has a truly sophisticated arsenal, escalation dominance clearly still rests with the United States, and there the U.S. wouldn't even have to consider crossing the nuclear threshold to maintain its dominance of the situation. At the moment, Iran may very well be thinking in sort of broadly vague terms about all the benefits that it would reap if it had an advanced nuclear option. But as you can see, my argument is that the shorter the timeline to breakout becomes, the more Iran would start to think about how it would actually use it in a crisis situation. And the more it uses about that, the more it will be concerned and want to shorten that timeline as much as possible. And it might, at that point, decide that it's not worth maintaining the fig leaf of having a civilian nuclear program, but instead it can throw off international inspectors and move pretty quickly to full nuclearization. So the broad implication of this, I think, is to give pause to people like myself who in the past have argued that, well, let's not get too worried about Iran yet. It's not really clear that they've completely committed themselves to a full nuclear arsenal, but that it's pursuing the option to do so. And as I've tried to argue here, that's not really a stable outcome, and that Iran should be kept as far as possible away from starting to move into that space where it's thinking about actualizing it. I, of course, have developed a foolproof plan on how we can do this, but since I'm limited to 15 minutes, I'll take that secret to the grave with me. But just looking at the negotiations, I would say that there's a good reason to drop the insistence on complete enrichment suspension, because while we do that, the Iranians are simply moving further along and improving their enrichment capacity and are accumulating ever-growing stockpiles of LEU. So I think it might be useful to enter into negotiations with the thought that the primary objective is to limit the size of the Iranian LEU stockpile. And finally, it's just sort of the irony of all of this is that because the verification that has been absolutely valuable and necessary that has accompanied the growth of the Iranian nuclear program has generated these sorts of dynamics, it also makes for a really terrible crisis dynamics. That's all.